All right, let's dive into Entity Framework Core. We're going to help you prep for those upcoming interviews and make sure you're ready to handle any EF Core question they throw at you.
Sounds good to me.
We're using this awesome compilation of the top 100 EF Core interview questions and answers, and it's got everything. Basic definitions, the complex scenarios. I have a feeling this deep dive is going to be super useful.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, these questions, they cover everything from, like you said, the basics to some really nuanced things.
Okay, so first things first, what is Entity Framework Core? I see this definition here. Open source, lightweight, extensible, cross-platform. Okay, great. But what does that actually mean for a developer?
Yeah, sometimes you need to cut through all the jargon. Basically, EF Core is this powerful tool that lets you work with your database, but using C# code.
Yeah.
So you're not, writing all that raw SQL.
So it's like what? Like a translator between my code and the database?
Yeah. Exactly, like a translator. It saves you a ton of time and effort, and you can build really complex applications, and it's open source. So, huge community of developers supporting it and working on it.
That's a big plus for sure. So how does this magic actually work? I mean, the source mentions all this stuff, DB context, DB set, model. Can you break that down for us?
Okay, so think of DB Context as like the central hub, like the command center for all your database stuff. It manages connections, tracks changes, and translates your commands into actions that the database can
Yeah,
understand.
okay, command center, got it.
The DB set is basically it represents a specific table in your database. So it's how you query and manipulate the data in that table.
Okay, makes sense. And then what about the model? What's that all about?
Model is like the blueprint. It's the map that connects your C# classes to the tables in your database.
So if I change something in the model, does that automatically update my database?
It can, depends on your configuration. But EF Core is smart. It can handle migrations for you. Really powerful.
Wow, so it's like EF Core is trying to make my life easier.
That's the idea, for sure.
Yeah.
Less tedious work, more time to build awesome applications.
Okay, so we've got these pieces, DB context, DB set, and the model. How do they work together? Like, what's the flow when I'm using EF Core?
Okay, typically you start by defining your entities. They're just C# classes representing the data that you want to store in your database. Those are part of the model. Then you got to configure DB context, telling it which entities to manage and how they map to database tables.
So I'm like setting the rules.
Precisely, setting the rules of the game. And once you've done that, then you can use your DB context to perform actions like adding new entities, querying, updating records, and deleting entities.
All right, so it's like my one-stop shop for all my data access needs.
You got it. And it's intuitive. You don't have to deal with the database directly.
Okay, this code-first approach keeps popping up. What is that?
So code first is a way to define your database structure, but you use C# code instead of going into like a database management tool.
Huh. So instead of SQL scripts, I'm writing C# classes that represent my tables.
You got it. You create your entities, you define properties and relationships, and then EF Core takes it from there. It generates the database schema based on your code.
Some developers might not like that. Giving EF Core so much control, what are the advantages?
Well, code first is really popular for a reason. It just makes everything so much smoother.
Yeah.
You work with just one code base, both your application and the database.
So version control is easier.
Exactly. It's easier, it's consistent, and your database stays in sync with your code. It's great for agile teams and CI. It's all about speed and efficiency.
I'm seeing the appeal for sure. So migrations, it sounds like those are pretty important. How do those work?
With migrations, you can easily keep track of any changes you make to your model, and then you can apply those changes to the database in a controlled way. No surprises.
Okay, so starting to get the hang of this. We've covered the building blocks, DB context, DB set, the model, and this whole code first thing.
We've laid a good foundation, but there's so much more to explore.
I know, right? We're just getting started. Let's take a quick pause and then we'll come back and really get into some of the more advanced stuff.
Sounds good. I'm ready when you are.
Okay, welcome back. Now let's get into some of the deeper, trickier concepts in Entity Framework Core.
All right, sounds good.
You know what they say, the devil's in the details. And when it comes to interviews, a lot of times they're going to want to know, do you understand the nuances of EF Core? Those little things that can really, make or break your code.
Yeah, for sure. They want to know you can handle those tough situations, not just the simple stuff.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's jump into it. I'm seeing something here about shadow properties. What are those and why would I even use them?
Shadow properties. So those are properties that EF Core manages behind the scenes, Like they're not actually defined in your entity class.
Okay, but they're in the database.
They are. They exist in the database, but not in your code.
So like secret data.
Kind of, yeah. You use them for things like, audit information, timestamps, maybe foreign key relationships, things you don't want to explicitly put in your entities.
So EF Core is tracking that stuff for me without me having to write extra code.
Exactly. Keeps your code clean and focused.
Okay, that makes sense. So another thing that I see come up a lot with EF Core is lazy loading. When should I use it and when should I maybe avoid it?
Lazy loading, that's when related data isn't loaded until you actually need it. Sounds great for performance, right? Don't load everything up front.
Right.
But you got to be careful. It can actually cause performance problems if you're not careful.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about it. Say you've got a bunch of entities, and you need to access a related entity for each one. With lazy loading, EF Core is going to go to the database every single time.
So I'm making a ton of queries.
A ton. It's called the N+1 problem.
Yeah.
Like you're doing N+1 queries, where N is the number of entities.
Whew. Yeah, that sounds bad. Okay, so when is lazy loading a good idea then?
It's a good fit when you've got like really complex data, lots of relationships, and you only need a tiny bit of it at a time, in specific situations.
So it's all about knowing the trade-offs.
Yeah, exactly. Trade-offs. Okay, now speaking of performance, concurrency, that's another big one they'll ask about in interviews.
Yeah, concurrency, always a scary word.
Well, it just means, like, what happens when multiple people are trying to update the same data at the same time?
Oh, right. So things could get messed up.
Exactly. Data corruption, inconsistencies, bad news.
So how does EF Core deal with that?
It uses something called optimistic concurrency. Basically, it assumes conflicts are going to be rare and only checks for them when you're saving changes.
So it's not like constantly locking everything down.
Wait, that would be a performance killer.
So what happens if it does find a conflict?
Then it throws an exception. But that's good. Gives you a chance to handle it properly.
Oh, so I can decide what to do.
Right. Reload the data, show the user the conflicting changes, let them decide. Okay, now concurrency is related to another important concept, the unit of work pattern.
Unit of work. I've heard that before, but remind me, what is that again?
Unit of work is a way to group a bunch of database operations together into a single transaction. So either they all succeed or they all fail.
Oh, so it's like all or nothing.
All or nothing keeps your data consistent. And the cool thing is, EF Core's DB context, it actually implements the unit of work pattern behind the scenes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when you call save changes, it wraps everything up in a transaction, handles it for you.
Nice. So I don't have to manage transactions myself.
Nope. EF Core takes care of it, makes your life a lot easier.
I'm really starting to see why everyone loves EF Core.
It's a great tool, but, there's still more to learn.
Oh, for sure. Way more. Let's pause for a sec, and then we'll wrap things up with some final key concepts and some tips to really nail those interview questions.
Okay, we're back. Final stretch of our Entity Framework Core deep dive.
All right, let's do it. We've covered so much, all the basics, some of the tougher stuff. But before we wrap up, are there times when EF Core, well, maybe it's not the best choice?
It's funny you should ask that. Because, yeah, EF Core, it's great, but it's not a magic bullet.
Right. Not a silver bullet for every data access problem.
Right. Like, it's not always going to be the fastest option if you need, like, super optimized data access.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's adding a layer of abstraction, so sometimes that can impact performance.
So if I really need speed, what are my options?
Well, you could look into micro ORMs like Dapr.
Dapr.
Yeah, Dapr gives you more direct access to the database, but, more control, more code you have to write yourself.
Okay, so ease of use versus raw performance. Interesting trade-off. Any other times when I might, I don't know, choose a different tool over EF Core?
Well, if you're working with like a really old database, a legacy system, something with a weird schema.
A really messy schema.
Yeah, EF Core might struggle with that. You might be better off with a more flexible data access library.
Makes sense. Okay, so testing. How do I test code that uses EF Core? That always feels tricky, databases and all.
Yeah, good point. One common approach is to use, an in-memory database for your unit tests.
In-memory database, okay.
Yeah, that way you're not actually hitting a real database. It's faster, and it's way more reliable for testing.
Ah, so I can just focus on the logic.
Exactly. Now, for integration tests, well, then you do need a real database. But, use a separate test database. Keep your test data isolated.
Right, keep things clean.
Exactly. And one more testing tip. Focus on the interactions with EF Core, not on testing the framework itself.
Got it. Assume EF Core works, don't reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. All right, almost done. Last but not least, performance tuning. This one always comes up.
Oh, yeah. Everyone wants to know about performance, especially with databases.
So first thing, think about how you're querying your data. LINQ queries are great, super powerful, but they can be inefficient if you're not careful.
So watch out for bad LINQ queries.
Yeah, like don't use select if you only need a few columns. And be careful with operations that load tons of data into memory.
Okay, what else? What other performance tips do you have?
Use eager loading, when you know you'll need related data.
Ah, right. We talked about that. Instead of lazy loading.
Right. Fewer trips to the database, much better performance.
But didn't you say there were trade-offs with that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
You might end up loading more than you need. So again, it depends on the situation.
It's all about choosing the right strategy.
Wow, we've covered so much in this deep dive. I feel like I could walk into any EF Core interview and just, ace it.
I think you could too. We talked about all the core concepts, the tricky stuff, even when EF Core might not be the right choice.
Right. And we talked about concurrency, testing, performance tuning. It's all here.
It is. So to everyone listening, good luck with your interviews. And remember, EF Core is a powerful tool, but the key is to really understand how to use it. Keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, go get that job. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Entity Framework Core.